I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about sensory analysis, and basically what sensory analysis is, it's pretty similar to tasting beers competitions, but not exactly the same. So for tasting beers, when you judge them, you're doing the same thing as sensory in that you're analyzing the beer. The tasting procedure is pretty much the same. You're looking for certain off flavors, certain characteristics of the beer when you taste it. But for tasting and judge beers, you're generally analyzing a trueness to like a general style and looking for a preference there. When you're tasting for sensory analysis, you're analyzing a trueness to a brand, so it's a little more specific, and you're pinpointing off flavors. So it's important actually not to include any preference when you're tasting for sensory analysis. It's something you don't really want to be thinking about. You just want to be kind of stepping back from the beer and looking at it very analytically. So sensory tasting technique. Got a glass of water here that I can kind of show you the technique with. You want to check for clarity, color, solids, foam first. Same as when you're tasting at a competition. So you look at it, maybe swirl it a little bit. We have little lights in our sensory room. We put it above to kind of really light up the beer so you can see any little bit of haze. And it's just kind of a visual check, you know, it looks how it's supposed to. All right. Next, you want to swirl the beer, bring it towards your face slowly. And you just kind of start out here. Some scents are really, really easy to pick up and really strong. And that's why you do this step. Because if you get it out here somewhere, you don't want to bring it all the way up to your nose or completely, blast your palate. You'll never smell anything for the rest of the session. So yeah, you start away and kind of rotate it, bring it forward, and you're sniffing while you're doing this. Then you bring it all the way up to your nose if you haven't detected anything really strong, and you do 3 short sniffs and then a long sniff. And you can stick your nose right down in it. You can be swirling a little bit. You don't want to swirl too much. You might splash yourself. Happens all the time, actually. But yeah. So just be careful when you get the beer close to your face. Finally, you cover it with your hands. And actually, another step I like to do is smell my hand first. Make sure it's clean. If you can get your palm or something, that can really throw off your sensory experience after you put your hand on the glass. So yeah, cover it with your hand and swirl it again. Now you can get pretty vigorous, and then you can cover your hand in beer or whatever. And then 3 short sniffs and a long sniff. So basically that's just breaking out some more aroma compounds and collecting in the top of the glass. So anything, it's kind of concentrating the aromas. That way you can really get a good idea. Finally, the best part, you taste it.
Chlorine.
Yeah. So that's the deal. It's pretty intense, and that's how we try to, at least at Deschutes, that's how we try to do every kind of taste that we do, every sample. It's important to kind of be consistent. You might not run through the exact same process, but it's doing it the same every time. It's very important for the kind of analytical nature of sensory analysis. Oh, one more thing. When you taste it, unlike with wine, you have to swallow the beer. That's something that sensory beer analyzers came up with. Get some flavors in the aftertaste and stuff. So you have to drink it. All right. So if you're a tester setting up a sensory test and you want to have a panel that's going to tell you something about the beer, there's a few guidelines, general guidelines that are always good to follow. You want an area without distractions. This is a picture of our sensory lab. And so you can do about 5 people at a time. We've got screens there where they rate and scale the different flavors. You don't need that. It can be a piece of paper that people are writing on. But this is the easiest way to get it into our computer system for analyzing the data. Again, we've got the lights for looking at clarity and visual. You don't need that, you know, you can just use your eyes. But they are all kind of separated, so there's no like visual distractions. All you see is kind of white, gray, tan. The only thing that's going to kind of stick out to you in this booth is the beer. So it's good to have that kind of an area. You also want it to be kind of quiet. You want the focus to be on what you're tasting and what you're seeing. You want to randomize the samples, but have all the tasters taste, or all the testers taste the same samples. So random order, each taster may be going in a different order. They don't know what order it is, of course. That helps to make it, you know, when you're analyzing the data, kind of even out any kind of biases that are going to develop. You know, people don't start getting that, oh, it's the second one, or they walk out of sensory and talk about it, and you know, you start getting a bias from that. And then you want to use a numberless visual scale. You know, when people thinking about, oh, is this a 5 or a 6, you just want it to kind of be a gut instinct. What we use is a line, and you just kind of make a dash on the line wherever you think it is. You know, this end is 0, nothing, this end is intense. The most you've ever tasted in beer. It's kind of a personal scale, but it's scale with the data analysis. You can scale all your different sensory panel members' responses. And so as long as you get the kind of same shape to the various scalings, you'll end up with some very useful data. Don't test more than 10 to 12 samples at a time. You have to swallow the sample when you're tasting beer. You don't want to drunk people telling you about your beer. But yeah, also your palate's going to get tired after about 10 to 12 samples. And train and know your testers. You know, I mean, one very very clear thing is everybody does not taste the same. As long as you train your testers, you know, you can train them that this off flavor is this off flavor. It might taste like butter to somebody. It might taste like, you know, Lucky Charms to somebody else. But as long as they both know that that's the flavor they're looking for, so they can identify it in a sample, that's what's important. You also want to know some people are more sensitive to some flavors. Some people are blind to some flavors. They can't sense them at all. So if somebody that's blind to, say, diacetyl, scales diacetyl really high, you may not want to pay as much attention to it if you know that they really don't smell that flavor at all. If somebody's really sensitive to it, scales it really high, you also might not want to pay too much attention to it because you know they're very sensitive to it. So, you know, it might not be a really strong flavor, but they pick it up really strong. All right, so if you're tasting in sensory, here's a few guidelines. You don't want to eat, drink, brush your teeth, apply anything with aroma, or do anything like that within half an hour before testing. You want your palate to be kind of clean and ready to go. That's not always possible, but yeah, if you can do it, it's the best way. Try to wait to have big meals until after testing. Really the best time to do sensory testing is when you're really hungry, because your body's kind of like, I want to eat. It starts noticing a lot of smells and aromas, and you get actually more sensitive and better when you're hungry. So if you can wait to eat. Make sure your hands are clean. I mentioned that earlier. If you're covering the glass with dirty hands, you're gonna transfer some aromas on there that might throw you off a little bit. And cleanse the palate with water between samples. Water is generally just a good one to use because it's classically odorless, flavorless. So, especially if you have good water like we have in Bend, water is the best way to go. You can also use crackers. If you do, make sure they're not salted and don't chew them. You'll get little pieces of cracker stuck in your teeth, and they'll affect your tasting on the future samples. So what you want to do is just kind of put them on the roof of your mouth, put your tongue against them or whatever, and let them melt and dissolve and get all mushy and swallow them. It's not that pleasant, but it cleanses the palate. So there's two types of sensory tests, generally that are done very often, at least in Deschutes. And the first one of these is a triangle test. A triangle test, you have 3 samples in black glasses. It looks like this. All right? It's used for telling if 2 samples are different. The reason glasses are black, so you can't see the difference. You don't want to use visual in this test. You're usually testing for a difference in flavor or aroma. Visually, the reason you don't use visual is because visual people can usually tell anyway. I mean, it's very obvious if 2 beers are significantly visually different, and so you actually want to hide that if you're tasting for flavor and aroma. So in 2 of these glasses, and you don't know which 2, and it'll be randomized for each taster, of course, there's the same sample. In 1 glass, there's the other sample. And the testers try to choose a different one. They'll taste all 3, and you'll say, okay, well, which one of these is a different sample? Click it. And if enough testers actually choose a different sample, then it is different. It works just as well if enough testers don't choose a different sample. Then you can say, all right, that's not different. That is the same beer. People cannot recognize that it's different. And there's a lot of statistical analysis that goes into deciding whether enough tasters have chosen. It's not just a majority. It's something where you have to use statistics, how many tasters you had. You know, there's already 1 in 3 chance that they're going to pick the right sample just randomly, so you have to take that into account. So there's some statistical analysis that goes on there. But yeah, if everybody chooses it differently, obviously it's different. You know, if 3 out of 8 choose it differently, it's obviously not different, and then there's some gray area in there. Second kind is kind of a true to brand test, a release test. So it's used to tell if a sample is within specification for a brand, just what you're trying to hit. And use clear glasses for this one, for full tasting method. There are 3 samples up here right now. That was actually just a coincidence. Basically, it could be 1 sample on there. 3 samples just meant we were tasting three different tanks of this beer that day. So you know, just taste them all and see if they're within spec for the brand or not. All right, this is a fun screen that you probably can't make out at all, but I'll kind of go through it. So this is just showing our computer screens for each step. First is visual analysis, and we have check boxes here that say, you know, bright, slight haze, cloudy, sedimented particles, or suspended particles, and you just check whichever one of those you think it's closest. Then we have what we call typical flavors. These we have to scale up for the brand. We don't have a choice. It won't let us step through unless we scale all of these flavors. And really all it is just a line that says none to intense, and then the red lines are where you mark it on the screen. So you just say, oh, this is about, you know, 0 to the most I've ever had. This is about where this falls. And you just go through and hit that for all the standard flavors. Then we have all the flavors that you could possibly get listed. And there's actually like 3 screens of this. This is just one of those screens. And so you can scale. They like to have as much information as possible, of course. So anything else you pick up in the beer that's kind of out of the ordinary, or maybe significantly higher or lower than normal, you would just click the box and it'll pop up a line like this on the screen, and you just scale it what you think it is. And finally, you have a go or no go screen. It just says either it's go, true to brand, sellable beer, or it's a no go. There's no noticeable defects and we can't sell this beer. And so you just check which one of those you think it is, you know. Actually, after that screen, there's another screen that says why did you select go or no go? So it makes you think a little bit. All right, why you write down either the most offensive thing about the beer or a reason that it was good. So why do all this? What's the point? Well, it's the most accurate measure of perceived flavor, which doesn't always line up with instrument analysis. I mean, a classic example is IBUs. You can get an analytical number for IBUs from any beer. You can test it. But it doesn't equal perceived bitterness necessarily. You know, I mean, if you have a lot of malt body in a beer, very sweet beer, you can have more IBUs in there and people still won't think it's as bitter because it's got that sweetness to balance the bitterness out. If you have a very light malt body, really no malt, just fill it up with hops, people are going to think it's crazy. It's really bitter, but it might not be all that bitter. You could actually have higher IBUs than the one that has more malt body, and people would still perceive the lower IBU beer as being more bitter. And so perception is really the most important measure. I mean, what people are going to taste when they're drinking the beer is really what you care about the most. So that's a very important reason to do sensory. It's also, good indication of what people tasting the beer are going to think. And finally, you can pinpoint off flavors. And if you know where these off flavors come from, if you know the source of these off flavors, you can identify the problem in your process. So it's a good way to troubleshoot the process. If you know, hey, this flavor is coming out of this comes from, a bad fermentation or something. Well, we got to look at our yeast pitching rates, or oxidation, and something like that. All right, so what are some of these crazy flavors? Well, this is the flavor wheel. And you may have wondered before why there's so much aroma analysis and sensory, and then you just kind of taste the beer at the end once. Partly because flavor and aroma are very closely linked, so you're going to get a lot of the same flavors out of smelling the beer that you are out of tasting it. There are a few flavors that are easy to get in taste. Most of them are actually easy to get in the aroma of the beer. So we focus on that. It's also because of the flavor wheel, we have, really should be called the aroma wheel. We have this many that are flavors that you can't really smell in the beer, you can only taste. Up over here, these are things like salty, sweet, bitter, your classic flavors, sour. All of those are related to flavor. Up here, again, important for tasting is mouthfeel, things like CO2, carbonation burn, warming from alcohol, mouth coating, astringent. These are all very kind of mouthfeely things you have to be tasting the beer to get. But the rest of this, all the rest of it is aroma. So 3/4 of the wheel about is based on smell. And these aren't all the flavors that you get in beer, but they're a good majority of them.
I'm guessing moldy is one you usually try to avoid. I see it up there.
Yes, moldy is not one of the, it's one you don't usually have to try to avoid that much. But yeah, moldy usually results in having some mold in your beer, so you got some problems. It's not a good one to have. So yeah, now I'm just going to go over a few of the more popular of these off flavors and ones that definitely can do something about if you sense them in the beer. Diacetyl is a pretty common one. It's butterscotch, buttered popcorn. It's actually the same compound used to flavor movie theater butter. So it's just this very kind of buttery flavor. You'll know it when you smell it. And it's common. It indicates trouble with fermentation. Yeast creates diacetyl during fermentation, but then at the end of fermentation, you may have read about the diacetyl rest. After primary fermentation is done, you leave the beer warm. Yeast will clean up that diacetyl. However, if the beer's been underpitched or overpitched, or the yeast has had some kind of problem, it might create too much of that diacetyl to clean up during the fermentation, or it might not be able to clean up the diacetyl at the end of fermentation just because it kind of conked out. So if you're cooling the beer, taste it before you do so. And if you get a lot of diacetyl, you can hold off on that cooling. And this is something we actually analyze diacetyl with a gas chromatograph in our lab. And so this is something we do at Deschutes every time before we cool a beer. We get the diacetyl below a certain specification. So once primary fermentation is done, we'll test all the tanks that are done with that, and we won't cool them until diacetyl drop below a certain level. If it refuses to drop, you can actually add a little more yeast to the fermentation. We do this through krausening, taking beer out of another fermentation that's in the middle of fermenting. So it's got a lot of yeast in there and a little bit of sugar left in the wort, and you just pump it into the other fermenter. But you could probably actually add just a little bit of yeast slurry and maybe some sugar and shake it up and get that yeast a little oxygen, and it'll start going and it'll clean up the diacetyl. Can be okay in small amounts. It's actually often present in beers because it's created during every fermentation. But you never want it in really large amounts. And I don't know if you guys have ever tasted a beer that's laden with diacetyl, but it's not pleasant. Acetaldehyde. This is another classic fermentation flavor. Green apple. Basically what it smells like. It's a higher alcohol. It's part of like esters. There's other kinds of similar flavors. Isoamyl acetate is banana. There's ethyl hexanoate, which is red apple. And there's other flavors that are kind of higher alcohol, fruity or solvent flavors. Generally, these are created by yeast during fermentation, and they're created more when fermentation is fast or uncontrolled. So if you get a fermentation that really gets hot for some reason and goes really quickly, that can be, you'll probably have some kind of estery flavors, including acetaldehyde. It can simply be a character of the yeast, actually. It's not necessarily undesirable because it's a character of the yeast. So there's many popular beers that have acetaldehyde in their flavor profile. One I always get acetaldehyde out of is Budweiser. So hugely popular beer, maybe the most popular in the world. But it has acetaldehyde to me anyway. But yeah, it can be a character of the yeast, but it can also be excessive if fermentation's been uncontrolled. So if you get this, it's unfortunate there's not a way to fix it. With that beer, it's just going to taste a little like green apple. But the next time, maybe you put the fermentation in a cooler place, or pitch it a little less, or less oxygen, something like that. DMS stands for dimethyl sulfide. It's a sulfur compound that tastes like cream corn. Yeah, best way to describe it. Sweet corn, and it's a sulfur compound. This is what we do those short sniffs for when you're tasting the beer. Do those little. That's when sulfur compounds will really come out. Generally, DMS comes from the malt or the malting process. Depending on how you malt or how you grow the malt, there's more or less DMS precursor in the malt. If there's more, then you can get more DMS. But DMS comes when you heat. So you heat the malt a lot during the malting process, so it can be developed there. You can get a lot of DMS potential just from the malt you get. But it also breaks down in the brew houses. Obviously, you're heating the malt a lot there too. So it's created and boiled off during the boil. In fact, that's the main way you get rid of DMS when you're making beer is boil the wort. It's one of those flavors you're trying to get out of the beer by boiling. But it's also created in the whirlpool, and when you're homebrewing, there's not always a whirlpool, and so usually you'll knock out fairly quickly. When you're brewing it at the plant, you have a specific whirlpool rest, and that time is usually centered around a kind of compromise between creating DMS in the beer and getting all the protein and truth out of the beer at the bottom of the whirlpool. So yeah, indicates too long a whirlpool rest or not vigorous enough to boil. I would say if you're getting DMS in a homebrew, it's probably the boil. kick up the burner somehow. It's more gas supply or something like that. Again, often desirable in small amounts. A major part of at least one well-known beer is on the flavor profile. That's Rolling Rock. Rolling Rock is classically DMS. Big on DMS. They used to have I want to say like a 45-minute Whirlpool rest or something, a really long one to encourage DMS in the beer. Which is something that, all of these off flavors, really what's most important when you're selling beer is to have a consistent product. Somebody's going to like your product. People that like the product, when you change it, they're not going to be happy. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you change it. You take a major off flavor out of it, the people are not going to be happy with that. So if you create a beer that people like and you're selling a lot of it, the key is to keep it the same, even if that means doing some crazy stuff like encouraging DMS. H2S, another sulfur compound. It smells like rotten eggs. This one made a beer with a lot of this in it. It'd probably be hard to get people to like it, but yeah, it's formed by yeast during fermentation. Like a lot of these flavors, I mean, yeast, creates over 2,000-3,000 flavors while it's fermenting. We just pick a few of them and try and judge the beer by, but it forms tons. Really, the major part of the flavor profile of beer. It's more common for lager and like Hefeweizen yeast, at least it is at Deschutes Brewing. It might be because we don't use those as much. We mostly use our house ale yeast. But yeah, we tend to get more H2S in beers when we're trying to do a lager or a hef or something kind of unusual like that. It can be a characteristic of the yeast for sure, and it often goes away with time because the H2S is a very volatile compound, so it'll blow off pretty easily. You can blow it off with carbonation, in fact, and that's what you can do. You have to right tank with a carb stone on it. You can hook up carbon dioxide to the bottom and just kind of bubble it through the beer and release the pressure on the top of the tank, and so you can kind of blow off that volatile H2S. You can actually smell it coming out of the exit, but it'll blow off fairly easily. The other thing to note is that the nose quickly becomes blind to H2S. It actually happens with a lot of sulfur compounds because sulfur is not a very pleasant odor. So, you sniff it a few times, you start drinking a beer with H2S. By the end of the beer, you might not even notice it. Your nose quickly adjusts. Acetic. Acetic is a vinegar-like flavor. In fact, it is vinegar. But it's, just sour and vinegary. Usually indicates acetobacter, which is an aerobic bacteria, and it's kind of just a contamination, and it'll create basically acetic acid in your beer, which will smell acetic. It can also be created from other souring bacteria or beer spoilers. Lactobacillus is one common example of something that creates a little bit of acetic. It obviously creates mostly lactic acid, which is why it's called lactobacillus, but it can create a little acetic as well. The first thing to check with this off flavor is beer lines, dispensing equipment, anything like that. If you're getting a lot of acetic in your beer, it's probably because the stuff where the oxygen is, where you're dispensing your beer, is not clean. So yeah, really clean the lines, test for any leaks that oxygen might be getting in there, and that'll probably correct the problem. But it can be desirable again, like all these flavors, and sometimes they are desirable in sour beers and small beers. If you're doing like a sour Belgian, you're using a bunch of crazy wild yeast. Wild yeast will sometimes create acetic acid, and it's not uncommon. I don't know if you've ever had Duchess Bourgogne. That's a pretty famous sour Belgian Flemish ale, and that has actually, I usually get quite a bit of acetic out of the flavor of that, the aftertaste especially, but I think it's delicious. Butyric. This is a great flavor. You have kids, you might be familiar with it. Yeah, baby vomit, putrid. It smells like puke, and you can notice this one. Notice this one in pretty small amounts in beer or really anywhere. So this is a scent that people are fairly sensitive to. It develops most typically, you'll get this from soil buildup in the brew house over time. When we first started brewing on our large system, the 150 barrel system, we actually had some problems with butyric. And we were like, what the heck is this? I mean, this one's never desirable. I mean, it comes from your brew house being dirty, which is a terrible thing, and it tastes terrible. So there's this, you never want this one in your beer. So we looked at our cleaning processes in the brew house, and we were cleaning each vessel with the CIP plant, but we weren't actually cleaning the lines between the vessels. It was a little bit of an oversight when put in the system. So basically the lines between the vessels when we were pumping the wort were getting really dirty, and that was creating butyric flavor in the beer. We changed our CIP regimes so that when you clean one vessel, it pumps it through the pipes to the next vessel before it returns it to the CIP plant. Problem solved. So if you're getting any of this in your beer, which, just check the hard to find and clean places in the brew house. That's the first thing to do. Wherever you might have little nooks and crannies that aren't getting clean, check them out.
Is soil a technical term, or is this like dirt out in the yard?
No, soil is a technical term. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh,
That's,
soil is like
you have dirt in your brew house. Put something in the magic shit. But yeah, no, this is just build up. Just build up on the sides of the vessels or on the sides of the pipes from pumping wort and malt and mash and stuff. Light struck is another classic off flavor. This is one of the scents that people are most sensitive to of all of them. People have a very low threshold for this, which is, I guess, why skunks evolved to be able to spray this scent on living things. But yeah, basically it's skunky. It smells like a skunk. Develops from UV light, breaking down the isoalpha acids from the hops. So it's a hop-derived compound, and UV light will do this to all hops over time. Brown bottles are definitely much better at filtering out UV light in the range that will break down hop particles. So brown bottles recommended if you don't want a lot of skunky flavor in the beer. Clear or green bottles, you will get skunky flavor for sure. If you have your beer in a clear green bottle and you don't want it to taste skunky, keep it in the dark and drink it quickly too. I've actually had experience, getting a beer out of a keg, sunny day, sitting outside in a beer garden or something, drinking it, and by the end you're getting the skunky aroma. You don't need much of it to pick it up. Again, not necessarily an undesirable flavor character of your beer. Corona, Clear Olives. It's super skunky. I thought you were talking about beer. Now, artificially skunky. They actually put the skunky aroma into their kegs because people love the skunky aroma of Corona. Down on the beach, grab Corona. You know how it's going to taste. When you get to the bar, they want it to taste the same way. So.
I gotta have something for the line to react with.
Daddy! This is one of the last ones I have here. This is a great flavor. It's probably my favorite flavor name that we have. It's blackcurrant arrives. Blackcurrant arrives, alternatively tomcat mix. They're exactly the same flavor compound, which is really weird. And it's amazing how your mind can direct what you're smelling. Because if you're thinking blackcurrant arrives when you smell this, you're like, well, it's pretty tasty. Maybe some kind of fruit juice or something. If you're thinking tomcat piss, you want to spit it out. Yeah, it's a compound that comes from hops. Citra hops, which is a relatively new kind of experimental variety, have especially high levels of this. I have a lot of experience gathering these hops, and you can definitely, even in the hop cooler, it's all cold in there, but as you break up the hops and put them in a bucket, you start smelling the catty aroma. You just gotta think black currant, black currant, black currant. But again, this is a desirable flavor in many beers. Definitely know what you're thinking when you taste it, and you don't want a beer to have too much of it, because then it's hard to think of black currant. Much easier to think of Tomcat taste. There was a beer we made at the pub that was a single hop beer. We were trying to check out the Citra hop at the time. It was an experimental variety that we were working on developing with some hop growers, and so we did a very light kind of golden ale and hopped it entirely with citrus. It got the name El Gato. So it's a good example of yeah, so that's pretty much all I have. We've gone over some common hop flavors and how to spot them. Do you guys have any questions? Anything?
What do you do with your off batches? They go down the drain?
It depends. We flake everything, absolutely everything. If there's any kind of growth, contamination, yes, down the drain. If it's a result of something like a fast fermentation or something, and we have enough of the beer that we can blend it out at a ratio that's not objectionable to the sensory panel, then we'll do that. You know, but yeah, if it's at all contaminated, actually we did have one batch with so much diacetyl in it that it just got dumped. There was nothing we could do to fix it, and yeah, it was just way overpitched or something. Somebody left the oxygen on while we're cooling. I don't know what happened with it, but yeah, that one did get dumped for just an off flavor.
So if you get away with it, you rework it back in a little at a time.
Absolutely. Any brewer who tells you otherwise is lying. We're not in the business of throwing money down the drain. It helps us keep our prices somewhat reasonable. But yeah, if it's something significant, it goes down the drain. If it's something that we can blend out, we'll blend it.
About how often do you dump a batch? How many batches a year?
I would say it's generally about one batch a year. We're pretty careful with our cleaning processes. We don't like to get contaminated batches. So, you know, and sometimes we dumped a batch this year that was in the brew house and we had a power outage. Power outage lasted about 8 hours, so it was sitting in the water tun going into the kettle actually just sitting there, but it was sitting there for 8 hours, and so that batch got dumped. I mean, that's just not worth putting in the fermenter. There's most likely going to be something wrong with it. So you know, it can be various things that lead to dumping beer, but for us it's about a batch a year, I would say.
My understanding with DMS, you said it developed during the whirlpool. My understanding is that's one of the reasons you want to cool the beer down right after the boil, is to also help prevent DMS.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. So if you're waiting in the kettle before you're running it through your wort cooler, that you're going to develop DMS for sure. Yeah.
At what temperature does EMS, I guess, stop developing? I mean, is there a certain temperature?
There is, absolutely, and I'm not exactly sure what temperature it is. I do know if you cool it down cool enough to put yeast in it, you're gonna stop developing DMS. That's definitely below the threshold. If I had to pick a number out of thin air, I'd say 120 degrees or so.
Do you use just one strain of yeast, or do you select yeast for different products?
We have one house strain of yeast that we use for all our mainline brands, and then a lot or a part of a lot of our other brands too. That's what we use most of the time. We do use other yeast though. Sometimes for our reserve series, we'll use kind of an alcohol hardy yeast so that we can get the alcohol up a little higher without messing around too much with the fermentation and the oxygen and stuff. We also use Belgian yeast sometimes. We want to create kind of Belgian flavors in the beer. A lot of times with our Reserve series, we make a lot in different ways and then just blend them all together. So like with a bis, we'll usually ferment some with a Belgian yeast. Some might do with a high alcohol, and then a lot of it will be just with our regular house yeast. You know, and then we'll barrel age some. We'll age some on vanilla beans, cherry bark. So we do a lot of different stuff and then bring it all together to kind of get a really complex flavor profile. We also, of course, when we make a lager, we can't use our house yeast because it's an ale strain. So we do enjoy making lagers down in the pub, especially in the summertime. And sometimes we get to make one at the plant, although the fermentation space is our limiting capacity as a brewery. So we really have to get the okay from production planning to make a lager at the plant, but whenever we do make a lager at the pub or the plant, we use a lager yeast. Works better that way.
Speaking of yeast, how many generations do you keep?
We go out to about 10 to 12 generations, ideally. Sometimes that'll get up to 20. But basically, it's again, a product of tank space. How soon can we prop up a new generation of yeast? And usually we'll pitch a new prop into a 1 brew tank. Most of our tanks can hold at least 2 brews. So when we do a 1 brew tank, we're wasting some tank space there. Or not wasting it because we do new yeast, but it's tank space that we can't use. So if it gets delayed beyond 10 to 12, it's just, we're really busy, and but after it gets to around 20, we'll just, it doesn't matter how busy we are, we'll have to do it.
Quick follow on, what size do your fermenters range from?
We have 100 barrel fermenters. That's the smallest that we have. Actually, we have a couple of tanks that we can use for fermentation or conditioning of beer that are in 55 barrels. So technically, we do have a couple of smaller tanks, but we don't usually ferment in those. We have our smallest regular cylindrical fermenters are 100 barrels. Our largest right now are 700 barrel fermenters. And then we're putting in next year some 1,000 barrel fermenters.
Wow.
Yeah, 2,000 kegs right there, ready to go.
With your hops, are you using mostly whole hops that are grown locally? And,
Yeah.
And also, how do you gauge the quality of the crop? I mean, the consistency of the crop? Are you doing lab testing and things like that? Or?
We do use mostly locally grown whole hops. We also use some internationally grown whole hops for specialty stuff, like EKGs we'll often get from England. East Kent Golden, sorry, and then some of the German hops we'll get from Germany. But yeah, we do a lot of hop rubs actually. It's a way of sensorially analyzing hops. Just take the hop, visually analyze it, break it up, see kind of what color you have, how friable the hop is, how easily it breaks apart. You get a good idea of the quality there, and then rub it on your hands and smell. You get the alpha acid all over the place, but yeah, you can pick up garlic aromas, onion aromas, obviously undesirable. Then citrus is good, floral is good, cheesy is bad, grassy is in between. So yeah, you can kind of develop flavor profiles and see how you like different hops. We do that on a regular basis. We also go to hop selection every year. When the hops are harvested and prepped, they bring in brewers from around the area, whoever's interested in coming, and you go and do that with a bunch of hops and say, okay, we want these ones, and these ones. So we definitely do that a lot with hops. We don't specifically do any laboratory testing of hops at Deschutes, but we do look very carefully at the laboratory testing that the hop growers do. And so we look at their numbers and trust them.
When you change your fermented geometry, like you're getting the new ones there, does that affect the flavor of the beer range?
It's a very interesting question, and one that we've struggled a lot with, actually, just determining whether it's true or not. We have so many different geometry tanks, because Deschutes, like most breweries, has expanded in kind of a piecemeal way, where, okay, what can we fit in the ferment, or what can we fit in our building right now? We have fermenters in our building that were designed to fit a specific location. We had some floor space open, we had a certain roof height. So we've got all sorts of geometry of tanks. I think from what we've found, it doesn't affect flavor so much. We don't do different pitching rates or anything. I mean, depending on the size of the tanks or how many brews are going in, obviously we pitch at different rates for that. But we don't do pitching rates based on tank geometry. What we find it affects actually is how well you can pull yeast out of the bottom of the cone, how well yeast sediments, how easy it is to filter out of the tank. So we actually sometimes will try to line up certain tanks with certain beers that are harder to filter or easier to filter. Definitely, we do a little bit of fermentation in brights, because right now, fermentation is our limiting capacity. And our bright tanks, rather than being cylindrical, have flat bottoms or dish bottoms. And we find that those are definitely a lot harder to filter out of. That makes clear sense. I mean, it's really hard to get yeast out of the dish bottom.
How do you go about finding and training your sensory testers? Do they pay employees, or they probably employee pool, or how's that work?
Yeah, basically any employee at Deschutes can sign up to be on the sensory panel. And what happens is you do beer tasting 4 times a week at 10 a.m. And then you do training once a week. And so, yeah, you taste, there's a lot of spike samples that you taste in training, or sometimes they'll spike samples in sensory too, and so they'll pay attention, they'll pay attention to how you taste, what you're good at tasting, what you're bad at tasting, and and you taste our beer 4 times a week, and it's pretty cool. I'm on sensory panel, it's good. 10 o'clock every morning, you get your beer fixed.
Since your brewery runs 24 hours a day, how long does it take to go through that, the 10 to 12 generations of yeast? Like, does it take a week to hit that?
It takes about 10 to 12 weeks. Well, typically fermentations are 2 weeks, but we obviously brew into fermenters every week. So we're brewing into half one week and half the next. And so, yeah, we'll pitch from one of those tanks into the next one. So pretty much a generation every week. It's very rare that we'll be able to pitch from a tank we brewed earlier in the week into a tank we brewed later in the week. They're just too close together.
Hey, is every beer blended then? That comes out of brew?
Not every beer is blended, but most beers are blended. Nitro Stout is usually, we'll do that in one of those small tanks I was talking about. So if we nitrogenate our Obsidian, which is what we have here in Texas, that won't be a blended batch, that'll be all part of a single batch. Although usually we'll have put more than one brew into the fermenter, so it's blended on the brew level. But most beers will blend multiple brews into a fermenter, then we'll blend multiple fermenters into a bright tank. And so every beer will have several different brews in it. Yeah. It's not necessary. Sometimes it's just because we were filling these different size tanks from other tanks, and sometimes there's actually a blending ratio. If something went wrong with the beer, this can't be 10%, that beer 5%, which makes it a real pain if you're working out in the cellar. You're moving lines around all the time, pumping a few gallons in from one beer and a few from the next, or something like that. So luckily, we don't have to do it too often that way.
Speaking of yeast, do you do any yeast washing? And if so, you're familiar with the dioxychlor method versus acid?
We do no yeast washing. I've heard of both of these methods, but I've never used either of them. What we do is just, we plate every yeast tank that we harvest. So we harvest from the bottom of fermenters, and that tank will be plated, put cyclohexamide in it to keep the yeast from growing. Anything else grows, and that tank is not used to dump it, get someone else.
The hops, you mentioned that you guys use whole hops primarily? Is that
Primarily whole hops. We use some extract in our IPA for first hops, just because it was, our equipment wasn't designed to handle the amount of hops that we were having to throw in the first hops of the IPA, and you get such bad utilization. We were throwing, I think, 120 pounds of hops, which was 4 or 6 like full trash cans full of hops into IPA at first hops, and some of them would come out and still be dry. It's like it wasn't working. So for in the interest of actually getting the bitterness that we wanted in the IPA, we use extract there. We also use some pellets. What will happen is that whole hops will store in bales at the hop warehouses. After a certain amount of time, as we get towards the end of the season, we'll know better what we're going to use and what we're not going to use this year. And if we're going to be keeping it for an extra time, then we'll have them pelletize those hops, because hops store better as pellets. Usually we'll use pellets in the first or second editions if we're using them. Occasionally with hop pens I mentioned yesterday, we dry hop with pellets at the end of fermentation. But that's just hop pens.
If you're brewing 24 hours a day, how often do you clean the brew system?
We clean the brew system once a week, except for the work cooler. The work cooler will get cleaned whenever it's starting to not be able to hit the cooling point that we want, which is probably 2 to 3 times a week. We also have a work heater on the big brew house. Like I said, we reclaim energy from our kettle stack, and we use that energy to heat work going into the kettle. So we have a heat exchanger for heating the work, and we'll clean that once a week in the middle of the week. But most of the stuff, just when we shut down at the end of the week, is when we clean it, which will be, that means about 40 brews. Hopefully soon, 50, 55, if we can get it running a little more efficiently. But yeah.
What do you use in the brew house for cleaning?
Sorry?
What do you use in the brew house for cleaning that was available to us?
Oh, what do we use to clean? Yeah. Well, caustic, I mean, so.
We can't get caustic.
No? Baking soda.
Well, we can,
But yeah, we also, I mean, it's mostly, pretty strong chemicals that you have to buy from a chemical supplier. But caustic and acid, and you might not be able to get those chemicals, but you can probably get some kind of diluted version of them if you check the labels on things that are in the store, Caustic is the main cleaning chemical. We also use hydrogen peroxide, which you can get as an additive to the caustic. It's kind of just an oxidizer. It's very active. It dies out after about 10 minutes, but we'll kind of shoot in a little bit of that over the course of the cleaning, just to kind of give it an extra boost sometimes. For sanitizing, we use peracetic acid, organic approved. So for our organic ale, we didn't want more than one sanitizer, so we use peracetic acid for that. But I mean, best sanitizer really is chlorine. The only issue is at a plant, it can create some safety hazards. If you have acid and chlorine, when they mix, you get mustard gas, so that's not a good thing to have laying around. So yeah, that's the reason we don't use chlorine, but that's really the best one. If you're trying to kill yeast and mold, it will just decimate those things. So, and then, what else do we use? For scrubbing and stuff, we have an alkaline kind of powdered cleaner. It's just an alkaline powder. It kind of reminds me of Tom, actually. I think it's probably a pretty similar deal. So, all these things are kind of stronger than what you can get in the store, but the store stuff is based on the same principles. So yeah, I would recommend, just caustic. If that's not working, maybe do a little pre-acid or some kind of acidic compound to start with, then don't rinse it and hit it directly with the caustic compound, and you'll get some chemical reaction there. It'll break out some heat, and that should help get things clean.
kind of efficiency do you see out of your mash?
We get in our brew house, we really measure efficiency based on malt and sugar that we put in versus what we pumped into the fermenter at the end. So for our entire, we really just look at entire brew house efficiency, I guess. But in terms of entire brew house efficiency, we're 91, 92% for a brew like pale, which we brew all the time, and we're pretty good at. We do fairly large batch sizes. For a brew like inversion, that's probably our lowest efficiency regular brew. That's usually around 85 to 88%, somewhere in there. If you want to get into brews like Double X Black Butte Porter or Mirror Mirror or Abyss, yeah, you know, our final runnings on Abyss are I think 18 Plato. So we're throwing a little sugar down the drain on that one. but you know, sometimes you gotta sacrifice yield for the brew you're trying to make. You know, yeah, I'm pretty sure we get about 50% yield on that beer. But it's okay.
Could you make a small beer out of the?
We absolutely could, and it's something that the issue is a place to store it. We brew all of our Abyss on our small brew house. The 50-barrel brew house, and so if we could continue running that off, that just runs directly to the kettle from the water tun. If we could continue running off that lower extract wort into another vessel and hold it, that would be, we could do that, but the only place we have to put it is the kettle. So at this point we don't have the means to save that wort. But yeah, I mean with Abyss, it wouldn't even be a small beer. 18 Plato first words would be a pretty regular beer. You know, but yeah, it's something we'd love to try sometime. Have the little Abyss rack or something, crevice. I don't know what you call
What can the average home brewer do to boost his efficiency? Because you know it's all about sauce mixture.
Absolutely. Boosting your efficiency, you know, the best way to do it, I mean, it depends on a lot on your equipment. You know, if you can get a keg set up water tun with a full kind of grid over the bottom, rather than doing a tube at the bottom of the vessel for straining on, that's going to help your efficiency. You know, if you can, I mean, shoot, if you're going to build a brew house, I would say make your water tun as large around as possible. So you can have a flatter bed, yet still cover the whole bottom, so you're kind of filtering off everything evenly. You're not going to get any crevicing that's going down towards your drain points. Another good thing is pay close attention to your sparge. You know, if you can kind of predict where you want to be, maybe measure your first runnings and see what Plato you're at. Kind of try and dial in your volume so that you run out of sparge, you kind of suck the last of the sparge into the kettle. That's a really, you know, good way of drying out your tank crane and not leaving anything in there. It's a good way to boost your efficiency as well. Yeah, you know what I mean. And then be careful during any transfers and stuff. You know, as little spillage as possible, obviously. So yeah, it's a pretty simple thing you can do.
Or I have the recipe for Black Butte Porter.
Actually, we do have a homebrew recipe for that. And yes, that's just a short answer. Yeah, and we have it. If you send me an email, I will email it to you.
Can we get a copy?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll send it to Mike and yeah,
Yeah, we can do that.
distribute it. Perfect.
How about phenolics? And how do you fix it?
Phenolics, yes, the branch of flavor I didn't even cover on this one. That was an oversight, actually. Phenolics can come from a few different sources. You know, it can be something. It's again often something that comes out of the yeast. phenols are tricky, actually to fix. I mean, like a lot of times when you're using a yeast that's heavy phenolic, like a Hefeweizen or a Belgian or something, that's the character you're looking for. I guess that, you know, if you're getting a ton of it, then maybe just kind of try and lower your pitching rate, you know, maybe keep your fermentation a little cooler, calm that yeast down a little bit if it's over the top. If it's something you don't want at all, then I'd say look at just choosing a different yeast strain, because usually if a yeast creates phenolics, that's what it's kind of meant to do. Yeah.
What's the characteristic like? Is it
The phenols can be kind of spicy in aroma, you know, spicy, phenolic. It can be kind of like vanilla character as well. So spicy, by spicy I mean like smelling spicy. It's not like hot pepper spicy, but like walking into an Indian grocery store spicy, you know. Yeah, they can also be. You can also get kind of burnt rubber kind of flavors from them. Chlorophenol is very medicinal. Bromophenol is one of my favorite descriptors. Actually, it says old TV. And if you smell bromophenol and you go smell an old TV, I swear to you, it's a descriptor. It also says electrical fire, stuff like that. So you can get these kind of like burnt plastic aroma as well. Generally, the ones that you want to hear that yeast are going to create are the more spicy ones. Chlorofluorocarbonol, you want to try and calm these down. We're getting a lot of that for sure.
When you were talking about transferring beer last night from the bottom, do you use gravity or pump?
That's definitely pumped. So on our JV side, we don't do that. It's gravity brew house. So on the JV side, we're dropping the grist from the top. We're dropping the water from the top. It's going through a hydrator, combining, and going down to the bottom of the mash. The way we're gentle with that mash is we put in foundation water. So we'll put in, 200 gallons of water to the bottom of the vessel so that it's not hitting the steel of the vessel when it first starts dropping. It's hitting a bed of water, get a little softer on it. And so that's actually a good homebrew practice. Have a little bit, maybe pour at least to above the plates or something, maybe a couple inches above. Have water in there first, then start adding your grist. It'll be a little softer on it. On the Hookman side, it's definitely pumped. So it's all combined. It's just pumped up through the bottom. It is actually a moino pump because at this point it's mash and water. It's got a lot of solids, so it's basically an eccentric kind of corkscrew that turns through an outer container that has the opposite corkscrew. So basically what you get is a space opens up on top, and then the thing turns and closes that space on top, but a space is opened up on the bottom, and so it pushes kind of like that through the moino housing. We also use a centrifugal pump on the way out of the mash tun. So you can pump it with a centrifugal pump. You want to pump with a little more head area in the bell housing and stuff, so that you don't jam it up and you don't want to beat up obviously the mash. That's what we're trying to avoid hot side inhibition and stuff. So you want it to be a fairly gentle pump with a lot of space in there, which means less efficient pump, but good for the application.
Do you play with your water chemistry at all, or do you just use the water you have?
We use gypsum salts in the mash, and we also use gypsum salts in the kettle. So we play a little bit with it, but we add actually very little gypsum salts. So our water, we have gray water up in bed. When it comes in, all we do is run it over a carbon filter to get the chlorine out of it. And then we pretty much just go into the brew house with it. We add, like I say, a very small amount of gypsum in the mash, and even less in the kettle. Sometimes we'll use sour wort with some of our special beers. We We have a sour wort culture from a brewery called Distelhauser from Germany, and it's just a bunch of like lactic acid bacteria, but it's not just that. We put it under the microscope. It's all sorts of stuff is in that. We're not exactly sure what it is. but you put wort in it, and you kind of do this propagation, and it sours up the wort. So it's kind of a natural way to be able to adjust the pH in beer. Obviously, we use that only pre-kettle or in the kettle. That stuff always gets boiled because we're not sure what's in it. So we want to make sure it's all dead. But yeah, those are a couple of ways. Sometimes we also put lactic in the mash, lactic acid, if we're trying to lower the pH. But again, it's small enough